Bob Roberts is taller than a good match rod and thinner than the tip. He's one of the gentlemen of the angling game, and I enjoyed the times we worked together on programmes a great deal. He has a wealth of wisdom and an empathy with water and the world of fish. In this programme, I've filleted the best bits of Bob's advice on feeder fishing and ledgering. And we'll start on the River Trent in somewhat lousy weather, but the fish don't seem to mind, and learn some useful tips and tricks from Gentleman Bob.
There is little doubt that feeder fishing offers most anglers their best chance of taking big bags of fish from rivers. Even the clumsiest beginner can throw out a feeder. In the right peg, he can expect to catch a fish or two. When the feeder was first popularised, it was heavily criticised as being a crude method and requiring no skill whatsoever. In the early days, it was crude, but no one can deny it caught fish. In some places it was banned in competitions, mainly I might add, because float anglers could not compete with it. For a while, the rivers were dominated by the feeder and anyone could win. There is no doubt the feeder offered complete novices a shortcut to success in the match world, but it wasn't to last. The fish soon wised up, and it wasn't long before top match anglers applied their skills and ingenuity to develop the technique into the sophisticated way of catching fish we know today. To achieve success on the feeder, you need a number of specialist items of tackle. I'll start with the rod. This is a feeder rod specifically designed for fishing rivers like the one we see here. It comes with two tips, a glass tip for medium range work and a carbon fibre tip for long range work. The rod is 11 feet long, but can be extended to 13 feet by adding the extension above the butt. This allows you to cast further, hold more line off the water, and pick up all that extra line on the strike. It also assists with casting heavier feeders and stronger flows, but more of that later. Today I will be using it at 11 feet. The flow through here isn't too strong. I'll only be fishing at about 25-30 yards range, and I'm quite happy to fish with a shorter version of the rod. It is essential to choose a good quality reel for feeder fishing. Cheap reels will not withstand the pressure and soon break down. Lines too need to be robust, mainly between 3 pound and 6 pounds breaking strain, and preferably they should sink. Most high-tech lines float, so beware. If you want to use a thinner line, don't necessarily go for the high-tech line. They're also very poor when it comes to abrasion resistance. It is important to have a height adjustable rod rest. Today I'm fishing in a weir pool with a concrete bank. It's impossible to stick a conventional rod rest into the bank. Normally I would use an aluminium tube extending rod rest, but today I'm using one that's made by Octopus, which fastens onto the bottom of my box and allows me to lift and lower the rod. It should ideally be of this pattern. You can see this butterfly rod rest is designed so that you cannot tangle when you, or even trap the line. Other than this, all you will need are feeders, clip-on leads, hook length material, and a selection of suitable hooks. My preferred feeder pattern is the Thamesley, and I use it in the small and medium sizes. Today, I hope to catch chub, and top quality hooks are vital. I will start on the carbon feeder pattern, which is strong and reliable. However, If the going is tough, I will step down to a lighter pattern. On the other hand, if we encounter big fish, I will immediately step up to a heavy-duty super spade. But remember, you must always match your hook length breaking strain to the strength of the hook. As an example, there's little point in using a carbon feeder hook with a breaking strain of line greater than 2 pounds, because a 4-pound line will straighten out the hook. If you need to use a 4-pound line, use a super spade hook. The block end feeder is ideally suited to maggot fishing. You can increase the size of the holes in the feeder to allow a faster release of bait if bites come quickly. What we must never have is to have maggots still inside the feeder when we hook a fish, or they'll be washed out all over the swim. The key to successful feeder fishing is concentrating your feed in one location. Your feeder must be cast to exactly the same spot every single cast. This will come if you practice. Our starting rig is as simple as you can get. The hook length is tied to the main line using a simple 4-turn water knot. A loop is tied in the end of the reel line, and this is threaded through the feeder cap and then trapped beneath the lead strip of the feeder. A hook is then tied direct to the end of the hook length. I'm starting today with a hook length of about 2 feet and a feeder tail of about 9 inches. We can adjust this length if necessary as the day goes along. If bites are slow in coming, I will lengthen the hook length. This will give the bait a slower fall through the water. But, on the other hand, if bites come fast and furious, I will shorten both tails down considerably. Anyway, let's get started and develop the technique. A good tip to remember when casting is to make sure the distance from rod tip to feeder is always the same. This will enable you to cast the same distance every time. If the distance from the feeder to the rod tip is 3 feet on one cast and 9 inches on the next cast, you cannot possibly cast the same distance because the angle of trajectory will be different. Get it the same every time. It will help you. After casting, drop the rod onto the rest. Allow the current to take up the slack and watch the tip. Here, we can see that the tip is continually twitching, which means that our feeder is not holding. Reel in and add a clip-on. These clip-ons come in various sizes and allow you to adjust the feeder weight very carefully. Remember though, that if you need 2 or more clip-ons, it will leave you few holes for the maggots to escape out of. In this case, switch to a bigger feeder, but do remember that you don't automatically have to fill it with maggots. Try and think how you would feed when float fishing. Take care not to overfeed the fish in front of you, or you may kill the swim. Right, I've cast out with the extra lead attached, and the feeder is holding nicely, so now is the time to fine-tune it. I aim to balance my feeder so that the slightest touch from a fish will dislodge it. To do this, I lower the front rod rest a little at a time until it begins to move. At this point, raise it slightly and the feeder stops. I call this critical balance, and should a fish pick up the hook bait, it will tip the balance and our feeder will move. When that happens, the tip will spring back to indicate a bite in the classic drop-back fashion. Never try to tighten up to the feeder in flowing water, because you will never be able to do it without using loads and loads of lead. Use a bow in the line between rod tip and feeder. This will allow you to use much less lead and give better bites. You will also hook more fish. However, all this fine-tuning will be a waste of time if you fail to cast accurately. I cannot stress too much the importance of accurate casting, but a word of warning. Do not trap the line under a line clip to guarantee the casting distance. If you do this and then connect with a carp or big barbel, you will be in all sorts of trouble. Correct striking techniques are vital to feeder fishing. Many anglers strike far too hard and regularly smash up on the strike. Striking should be a controlled movement. When a bite is registered, your hook is already in the fish's mouth. You need only to move the hook a few millimeters to connect, so take care. When a bite registers, lift the rod firmly, watching the tip, and feel for the vital moment of penetration, and stop the strike there at that moment. Fail to do this, and you may rip out the hook, or worse still, you could be cracked off. Okay then, let's tighten up your techniques a little further. Once fish move into your swim and begin competing for the bait, bites may come within seconds of the feeder hitting the water. Cast out the feeder and just before the moment of impact, sweep the rod back and follow the feeder with the rod tip until it hits the bottom. You will then be able to react instantly to a bite. Before moving on, let's just look at a few tips to increase your success. Firstly, floating maggots. Floating maggots are easy to prepare by putting a little water in a maggot tin, then adding the maggots. Make sure you have a lid that allows you access but stops the maggots escaping. A floating maggot goes some way to counterbalance the weight of a hook and will fool fish more than a sinking one. Next, watch out how you fill the feeder. Don't pack in the maggots too tightly or they will struggle to get out. It's far better to slightly underfill it than to overfill it. A problem many anglers encounter when feeder fishing is tangles caused by line twist. Line twist is caused primarily by using double or multiple baits. These spin on the retrieve. Whenever possible, try to get away with single baits. If you must use two maggots, try reversing one of them on the hook. This is less prone to twist. And finally, slow down that retrieve. It is rarely a race, and a good smooth rhythm will not be possible if you spend all your time sorting out tangles. Here's another tip. Where anglers regularly use the feeder, the fish may come to regard the green feeder as an object of fear. You will find that you will cast out a green feeder and fish shy away from it. They hang back off the bait, and you will continue to catch if you use a long tail, but the reason you're catching with a long tail is only because of the feeder, not because of the behaviour of the fish, how they're taking the bait. The answer to this is to simply black out the feeder with a felt tip marker pen. You'll be surprised how it can increase your captures on hard-fished waters. You may, like I do, find it much easier to use this double loop rig. Here's how you do it. Thread the feeder onto the main line and form a loop. Trap a loop of line with your fingers and twist this around once, twice, and now pull the feeder through this loop twice more. Now gently pull at the knot, making sure to wet the line as you do so. You will know if you've tied it correctly because it forms a figure of 8 during the tightening process. Now, tie an overhand loop at the bottom of the main loop, trapping the feeder above it. The size of this main loop is governed by the distance you cast. The further the distance, the smaller the loop should be. Somewhere between 3 and 9 inches is about right in most cases. You will see how the bottom loop now stands off. Your hook length is tied to this, keeping it away from the feeder when casting and playing fish. Once again, setting up and balancing the feeder is exactly the same as before. You may now find the amount of lead needed means few holes are free on the feeder. If so, step up to a bigger feeder. The longer lead strip means you have one less clip-on for the same weight. You will also have more holes available for the maggots to escape from. But remember what I said about filling the feeder. It is not compulsory that you fill the feeder with maggots. This may actually do more harm than good if there aren't many fish about. If half filling it means you get bites instantly, step up the feed, fill it. But if you do fill it and bites tail away, then cut back on the feed. Think about your feeding. Too many people today go feeder fishing and simply fill it to its full capacity and throw it out without giving feeding a second thought. Yet they would never do that with float fishing. If things are slow, a good dodge to try is twitching the feeder by plucking the line. If your feeder is correctly balanced, plucking the line will cause the feeder to move slightly, which in turn allows the hook bait to roll naturally along the bottom. This is often met with an immediate and instant response. Of course, you can twitch the line as often as you like if this proves to be the action which brings about bites. However, if moving the feeder brings about bites, there is a far better way to do it. A few seasons ago, when I was fishing the match circuit, I had a very successful run. It involved the use of a moving feeder that caught me loads of fish when everyone else was struggling by fishing a feeder almost like fishing a float. To achieve this, I set up a critically balanced feeder and then fed out a much larger bow than normal. At this point, the feeder was still balanced perfectly, but by lowering the front rod rest, it could be induced to move down the swim. The reason for the bigger bow was that it would make the feeder move down the swim almost in a straight line, rather than pulling round to the bank in an arc. Lifting or lowering the rod rest will either stop the feeder dead in its tracks or make it move faster. No other feeder method offers you so much control of what's happening down where the hook is. In experiments with friends, we found that the bow could be stretched a long way downstream without affecting the performance at all. Incredibly, if you take things to extremes and use a bow in your line 30 to 40 yards down the river and then back up to the feeder, bites will still register on the tip. And more incredibly still, bites will be connected with, but not by striking. All you have to do is lift the rod and reel down onto the fish. To explain why this works, we need to take a look at the business end of the rig. I've reverted back to the simple paternoster rig I used earlier, but I've shortened up the tails, so that the distance from the knot to the feeder is barely 3 inches, and the distance from the hook to the knot is perhaps 15 inches. There is no point in fishing a longtail because my hook bait is going to walk down the swim in front of the feeder. The interesting point comes when a fish picks up the bait. If it moves downstream, it hits the full weight of the feeder and hooks itself. If it stays still, the feeder will move past it and set the hook. Brilliant, eh? It certainly is on the days it works. Small barbless hooks are the key, and never even think about striking. Just reel them in. This is a ploy that can catch you those few extra fish when you think your peg has dried up. The Dink-Dink is a method which baffles anglers. It is a technique which defies logic and should never work. But believe me, it does. And what's more, I'm going to prove it once and for all. I'm fishing the River Trent, which is supposedly a difficult river, where fine lines and tiny hooks are absolutely vital. Just watch this. I'm going to cast out with a single maggot on a size 16 hook tied direct to 5 pound line. My hook length is just 1.5 inches long. Will it work? Just watch the tip. It's crazy, isn't it? To fish the Dink-Dink couldn't be easier, but remember, it doesn't always work. It helps if you can get a shoal in front of you first. But if you want to try it, you've got to tie the rig. The rig is simplicity itself to set up. Tie a single loop knot, like I showed you for using the long distance feeder fishing. Make sure your feeder's inside it, of course. Now, instead of trimming the end off, tie your hook directly to it. That's right, straight onto the end of your main line. Now, add plenty of lead to the feeder. This is not a situation where balancing the feeder will help. In fact, it will mean you miss bites. I've switched rod tips, so I'm using the stiffest carbon tip I own and fishing fairly tight to the feeder. The short hook length means that if a fish hits your bait, it will either be hooked by the weight of the feeder or the stiffness of the rod top. That's the theory. Let's put it into practice. Okay, I'm casting out. Now you can see the line has tightened up and wallop, there you go, fish on. It's crazy, isn't it? This method has caught big bags of fish from this river when sophisticated methods have failed. Here's a method I don't normally use on the River Trent. It's a method I use a lot when I'm fishing for big chub on rivers like the Swale and the Upper Witham. I've not really had much success with it on the Trent, but at least we can run through the principles if you want to try it yourself. The rig you use for this kind of fishing depends upon the range you are fishing at, based on the principles explained earlier. In this example, I'm simply using a paternoster for convenience. I've tied on a bigger hook because I'll be using a bigger bait. My feed consists of plain white bread that has been put into a kitchen liquidizer, a couple of slices at a time, and reduced to this consistency. You'll notice I've left the crusts in. Match anglers who are using liquidized bread for roach always take the crusts off, but I think it's an advantage when you're chub fishing. What happens is that the little bits of crust, they're released from the feeder and they'll move down the river and start to rise towards the surface, which immediately will alert a fish, but it will become waterlogged and actually sink back down to the bottom well down your swim, which means it will draw fish from a good distance downstream. For the hook, I've just got a couple of slices of fresh white loaf. Medium slice is the best. To put a piece of bread on the hook, I use a Drennan flake punch, which I think is a brilliant invention. Punch into a slice of bread on a firm surface, and a perfectly formed pellet is created. Slip your hook through the slot at the back. Pull out the pellet and turn the hook back through the flake. Perfect. You can guarantee the flake will survive the cast without flying off and stay on the hook for as long as you need to wait, which I hope won't be long. Let's find out. Easy. Well, it's easy when you know how, isn't it? Well, as you can see, we've moved away from the cauldron of the weir pool. Certainly much quieter here. We're only about 100 yards away from where we were before. We've come just above the weir, where the water is much steadier, much deeper, and we're going to have a go at groundbait feeder fishing. I hope, if I'm lucky, catch a few skimmers, maybe the odd chub, and just show you another technique, because feeder fishing is all about variety. If you learn all the techniques, you can catch a lot of fish. So, we're going to kick off on the groundbait, and I've simply used a bit of river ace and a bit of crushed hemp, nothing else. I'm only going to mix about half a bag up because we're going to give it perhaps an hour, 2 hours here, just to go through the methods. I don't expect to catch 20 pounds again, but we'll catch a few fish. Okay, let's mix this up. Put it in the groundbait bowl. I've mixed it while it's dry very thoroughly, and I'm just adding a small amount of water. Just a small amount at a time, and mix it vigorously and thoroughly, making sure you never overwet it. And this groundbait mix wants to be fairly dry. You don't want to be putting too much water in this at all, because we're not going to be firing balls in. It's all going to go in through the feeder, and so it's got to be dry enough to burst out. It wants to be a powdery, fluffy mix, just heavy enough to stay down on the bottom. Okay. We're rushing this a little bit because time's getting on in the day, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time showing you this. I think you all know how to do groundbait by now. Here we go. Just put the mix into the smaller bowl there, and let's run it through a riddle. If we run it through a riddle, it'll fluff it up. I'm probably teaching you to suck eggs here. You must have seen this on every other video you've ever seen. So, just push it through. See these hard lumps? You want to just break those down, break them down, and then throw them away if they're no good. I must say this is the first time I've ever feeder fished off a boat, It's a great old redundant barge here. It must be 60 years old or more. Right, that's very quickly got our ground bait done. It's very light, very fluffy, and that's ready. Okay, let's move over here and set the rig up. Although there are plenty of different kinds of ground bait feeders on the market, for river fishing on big rivers like the Trent, I stick to the good old Thamesley. All I do is I take the cap off, and if you push the bottom out, that comes out, and that leaves you with a conventional ground bait feeder. Sometimes if I'm using a really heavy feeder where I've got additional lead on, then I'll put a rubber bead in there. But we're only fishing very close here, so I'm just going to have the one shot there, and I'm going to put a shot behind it. Now, that is the rig. 2 shots, 1 swivel, and the feeder. What I'll do now is just put a hook length on here to the distance I want. If I want to fish it 2-foot tail, 3-foot tail, whatever I want. When the times are really hard and it's difficult to catch fish, I'll even go up to 6 and 7 feet tails. But for the time being, I'm going to put about 18 inches on there. Okay, all that remains now is for me to put a hook on. I'm using a simple loop-to-loop knot, nothing complicated. Just put one loop inside the other, slip the hook through, and there I am, ready to fish. That rig would suffice in most river situations. The only change I would make is if I was in very fast water or casting a long distance and having to use additional clip-on leads, I may choose to use power gum in that loop. But that is the only change. We're ready to rock and roll now. One thing we must always remember when we're feeder fishing, and that is to bait the hook before we fill the feeder. It's less important when you're using a ground bait feeder, but it's good practice, and if you do it when you're doing this, you'll do it when you need to do it. Now, filling this feeder. Of course, you could fill it with ground bait and use nothing but ground bait. Well, let's look at 2 proper ways of filling the feeder. Let's look at the one that maximises the amount of feed you can get in. Simply punch the feeder in there so you get a tiny plug in the bottom, and then you can load it with neat bait. You can get hemp in there, you can get casters in there. You could put a few maggots if you want, but they tend to break down the ground bait. And then just plug the other end. And what you have then is a sandwich. Ground bait, feed and ground bait. That's one way. If you want to put less in there, let's just push this out. Just mix a little bit of hemp and a few casters into your ground bait and then fill up straight from there. You probably get about 30% of the feed doing that as you would if you were plugging. You would use plugging if there were a lot of fish in your swim, if you were catching quickly, if the fish were on the feed and you had to keep it topped up. But if it was slow going, winter time, then just sprinkle it on the top and only put a small amount in. I'm going to cast this out now and let's see if we can get some fishing done. Okay. I'm lobbing this feeder about halfway across the river. You'll see I've dropped the front rod rest here because we're so high above the water sat on this boat. I'm achieving the same effect with the rod down as I would if I was down at water level with the rod up. The difference is that it's more comfortable to sit here and look down upon it. The flow isn't too strong through here. I'm just getting a few little movements on the tip. I may have to put one small clip on. I think it's important that a ground bait feeder stays static. Hello, that was a bite first cast. And we've got a small fish. It's a very small fish. Here it comes, kiting in along the top. Not quite sure what it is yet. And it's a small perch. I think we can lift this. Oh, here we go. There we go. First cast, a perch. Not bad for a river that's dead. Get the disgorger. It's very often easier to use a disgorger to unhook fish than it is to play about with your fingers. Even though I can see that hook and get hold of it, it's firmly lodged in the corner of the mouth, right in the jaw where it's tough. kinder on the fish to use the disgorger. There we go, dropped in the net. There's another good tip, I mean particularly for match anglers. I've got the net directly beneath my feet here. I dropped that fish, it fell straight into the net. Thousands of pounds have been lost on less. Just drop the ground bait feeder straight back down the same hole. A lot of people use the line clips on the reels to make sure the cast goes the same distance. You should never do that on a river like this. There are some big barbel around on this river. Hello, another bite. There are big carp. There are chub that will take line off you. And it would be foolish madness to actually use a line clip. It's much better to get into a rhythm. Well, we've got a skimmer now. There we go. Fish are certainly jumping straight onto this ground bait. Right, we'll use a disgorger again. There we are, hook straight out. Bit of a little skimmer. There's a bit of controversy about these. Some people say they're silver bream, some people say they're hybrids. I'm not sure and I wouldn't know how to tell the difference. Lovely fish though. Just drop him in the net. Right, gonna have to make a few changes now. We've been fishing about half an hour and we're getting a few fish, but unfortunately we're missing a few bites. There's no point in just carrying on as we're doing now, as we just continue to miss bites. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna turn this into a little bit of a bolt rig. I'm gonna overweight the feeder. I'm gonna add a clip onto the feeder, it doesn't really need it, and that will mean then that when I get a bite, the fish are only gonna move about an inch and it will hook itself against the weight of the feeder. That's the theory anyway, so let's try it. Just take a clip on, add it to the bottom of the feeder, Bob's your uncle, we're off and running again. We've now got that extra clip on. The feeder's holding hard. You can actually see the tip is bent round a little bit further than it was before. Nice and solid that. I'm pretty confident now that if we get a bite we'll hook it. Be nice to get another chub. One of the nice things about fishing the River Trent is you're not actually fishing just for one species. You can catch a mixture of species, even from the same swim. This morning was remarkable because we had chub, we had barbel, we had skimmers, we had roach, even had bleak and gudgeon. When you got a bite, you just had no idea what the next fish was going to be. And it's just the same up here. Well, this seems like a nice chub. I think it's going to be our last fish of the day. And like every chub you look in any river or any canal, it wants to spend its time underneath a boat. But here we are, it's up on top now. Nice fish, probably the best fish we've had all day. Oops. Here we go. Very difficult on the height of this boat. I've had to use a very long landing net handle. It's two handles spliced together, but here it comes. There we go. A River Trent chub. Nice fish. Probably about 1.5 pounds. Oh, he's well hooked in the scissors. There we go. What more could you ask for? I'm going to pop him in the net now. Oh, roll him down there. I'm going to take these fish now. I'm going to drop them back down near the weir. One of the problems of being up on top of a boat like this, apart from catching conger, is that there's no real way that you can satisfactorily release your fish. So if you do get the opportunity to fish from high walls, boats, think about the fish. Go and find somewhere that's as near as you can that'll bring you down to water level so you can put them back safely. Let's go and do it now.
Time to move on to more placid waters. Let's go over to Mallory Park for some Stillwater ledgering, and just for a change, I'll chat and leave Bob to do the fishing. Now, where's his script?
Here we are on a peg that owner Roy Marlow assures us contains a few bream. In many waters, bream are found at long range, but here at Mallory, they are mainly found within 25 metres of the bank. Go beyond this, and you are likely to run into trouble with big carp. Choose the right feeding options, and you will catch fish. Choose the wrong ones, and you won't. It's as simple as that. Let's look at those options. Option number 1 is loose feed and bomb. You'd only choose this option if you knew it was going to be very hard, say in winter, after a sudden frost and you were looking for an odd bite or two. If you start cautiously, you can always step up the feed. What you can't do is take it out again if you get it wrong. Option number 2. Balls of groundbait and bomb. Again, a fairly defensive tactic for when you are not expecting big weights. You might only introduce 2 or 3 balls to start with and fish over them. At least you can top up the feed if fish show an interest. This is also a method to consider for waters that are clear and shallow and the fish are shy. You can bait up and then sit it out knowing that the recasting of a bomb will not disturb them. Option number 3, the groundbait feeder. If you're fishing with a feeder, it means you are effectively introducing a ball of groundbait each and every time you cast. The amount of food introduced is governed by the size of the feeder. The great advantage of this option is you know for certain that the hook bait is in exactly the right place every time, right next to the feeder. Modern continental style groundbaits contain very little in the way of food. They are primarily carriers and attractors. They deliver the loose feed to your target area and give off smells which draw fish to the area and hopefully stimulate their appetites. It is the actual bait you put in the feeder that is the key to whether you will overfeed the fish. You can get a lot of feed into the swim by plugging the ends, or you can tease the fish by filling the feeder with groundbait and adding only a small amount of food. It is an option within an option, and one you should remember. Option number 4. Balling in groundbait and using the feeder as well. When local knowledge tells you the fish are really having a go, when the weather is right, say with a nice ripple and perhaps a bit of cloud cover, and providing your water has a good head of fish, this really is important, by the way, don't attack water that doesn't have a good head of fish. Now it's really time to go for it by introducing 6, 10 or even 20 balls of groundbait and fishing a feeder over the top to keep the table topped up. The amount you feed will be dictated by the head of fish in front of you. If it is one of those extra special days, you might even have to top up during the session, or even introduce a ball of groundbait by catapult every cast as well. But remember, these days are rare, and you are more likely to be successful if you take a little care over your feeding. It is the one job most anglers hate because it is so easy to cock up. There's nothing more embarrassing than seeing your balls break up in the air, as they say.
It's why a lot of anglers have a few quick chucks with the feeder instead. Very few people ever master the art of throwing balls by hand. If you grip it too firmly, it is likely to split in flight, and the distance you can achieve is limited. Catapulting is far easier, but even this is fraught with problems. But if you observe a few simple rules, catapulting is quite effortless. Rule number 1. Make sure your catapult has a pre-formed cup so that the ball doesn't get squashed and break up before firing. Rule 2. Don't put too much feed in each ball. Squats and casters are much better than pinkies or big maggots because they don't wriggle. Rule 3. Don't try to save time by firing out big balls. 2 small balls will fire out more accurately than 1 big one. Rule number 4. Skin each ball after you've formed it by wetting your hands and then squeezing it again. This will put a skin on the outside of the ball, which will help it hold together. Rule number 5. Pick a target to aim at on the far bank. You can see the greenhouse opposite. That is our target, and all the balls will be fired in that direction. We'll then cast our feeder in that direction, so we will then only have to get the distance right. Rule number 6. Always stretch the elastic the same amount and keep the elastic at 90 degrees to the frame, or you'll get a bruised thumb at the very least. Rule number 7. Make sure the angle of trajectory is exactly the same. And finally, rule number 8. Take your time. There's no rush. Why spoil a whole day for the sake of 30 seconds? Our tackle for bream today has had to be a bit of a compromise because it is almost certain that at some point we'll hook a carp, and if we do, we want to have a good chance of landing it without taking all day to get it out. To give us that chance, we've stepped up the line and hook size a little. On waters where carp are not a problem, size 22 and 24 hooks connected to 12-ounce breaking strain hook lengths are not uncommon, especially where skimmer bream predominate. Skimmer bream are generally fish up to about 1.5 pounds. Above this, once they've gone brown, people tend to regard them as true bream. Proper bream can be caught on very small hooks and light lines, but don't fall into the trap of following fashion blindly. Right, we've set up. And you can see Bob's holding the rod across his knee for support with a rod rest for balance 2/3 of the way towards the tip. This allows him to work the bait if he wants to, and it also helps concentration. If you get a bite, you do not want to waste vital time picking the rod up. In front of the tip, we have a target board. The target board will enable us to see the slightest bites. A simple rod rest can be used to achieve the same effect, but if it's windy, the board will give a little bit of shelter. You will notice we've chosen a flat-headed rod rest, which allows us to twitch the bait slowly if necessary, but more important, we can strike unhindered without catching up on anything. Bites from bream can be anything from a tiny movement of the tip to a full-blown steady pull-around. In summer, bream bites tend to be steady and deliberate. There's no race to hit them. Simply lift the rod and sweep it gently backwards until you connect. Don't be in any hurry, and do not try to bully the fish. Try to lead it away from the shoal with a minimum of fuss. Bream are shoal fish, and it is important not to lose a fish in the shoal or you might easily spook the whole lot.
common problem when bream are in the swim is to experience all sorts of trembles and flickers on the tip. This is caused by fish swimming into the line or simply brushing up against it. It's vital to protect your bait from the sun in summer. Make sure you shade it with a towel or an umbrella. Leaving bait out in the sun for any length of time will ruin it, so take a bit of time to ensure your bait stays in tip-top condition. Bob carries all his in a cool bag and freezes up a couple of plastic pop bottles to keep everything cool. If you don't need to have all your bait out at once, keep the rest of it in the cool bag for later. That way, it'll stay in tip-top condition. We've hooked a fish here, and as you can see, playing Stillwater bream is not a difficult thing to do. They're pretty obliging creatures, and providing you are patient and there are no snags around, you shouldn't experience many problems. In some waters, the bream seem to have quite soft mouths and hook pulls occur. If this is a problem, try keeping the rod at the same angle after the strike and don't lift it until the fish is ready for netting. This keeps the pressure on the hook hold to a minimum.
Time is, unfortunately, against us, and there always seems so much information that gets left out. Another day, another programme. Maybe, though, one last fish from Bob to close.